Today is August 10th, 2015. I'll link this to the bottom of the video. I wrote this article on Tuesday, July 29th, 2014. Probably took it from another paper because I noticed I made annotations on it, but it's an important understanding. I wrote here, stellar metamorphosis versus the iron catastrophe. And it has some huge problems. Number one, I'll read it out. If you want to pull this up and read it along with me, that's cool too. There is no mechanism for the heating of the first rocks that supposedly made Earth. The rocks are assumed to be hot based off the idea of pre-existing heat from gravitational pressure in outer space. This is contradictory to evidence that outer space is extremely cold, being a near perfect vacuum, I should have said, and the fact that gravity cannot pressurize material without a pre-existing celestial body causing the gravity. For the model of gravitational heating to work, gravity has to be present without a large celestial object like Mars being in place. This is a glaring logical contradiction. Basically, they ignore geology. To form rocks and minerals, you need an incredible amount of pressure and an incredible amount of heat. They just don't form in outer space where there's no heat and there's no pressure. So how do they get their clumping model to work? They ignore reality again. Number two, there is silver in the crust in nugget form, which is heavier than iron and has a much lower melting point. If the iron catastrophe were correct, then there should be no silver in the crust, because all the heavier elements that have a much lower melting point and are heavier than iron should have sunk to the center as well. There simply has to be another property of iron and nickel that causes it to clump together in the center, as is covered by stellar metamorphosis. Number three, there is no mechanism for 1 centimeter sized pebbles to clump into 1 kilometer sized rocks to form planets in outer space. That basically does away with their accretion models, with their protoplanetary disk models. It completely destroys them, yet they want to pretend as if it doesn't exist. It's the gorilla in the room, essentially. There are more gorillas in the room. Check it out. There's a whole gang of gorillas in the room. There is no mechanism provided to make the iron sink to the center. Oh wait, number four, I should say. Callisto is undifferentiated while the moon is. Both objects are roughly the same size, but one is differentiated and the other is not. This contradicts the hypothesis that objects can differentiate themselves via the iron catastrophe. If the iron catastrophe was a universal understanding, then it would be used to explain the other objects. The fact that it isn't used to explain the other objects means it's not. It was ad hoc to begin with. Number five, there is no mechanism provided to make the iron sink to the center of the Earth. Just saying a gargantuan portion of iron nickel measuring 1,600 miles in diameter just moved to the center of the Earth is not an explanation. It's not an explanation. What would convince the other elements to move out of the way? An experiment can be done that's shown the inanity of this argument. Simply set an iron dumbbell on the ground. If it moves towards the center of the Earth, then the iron catastrophe is worthy of science. Better yet, heat up the iron to its boiling point and pour it on the ground. If it sinks to the center of the Earth, then the hypothesis is correct, and we should test other materials that can sink to the center of the Earth. Obviously, that's kind of dumb because clearly it would have to move through the entire crust, and the crust is already formed, so I'll have to revise that. But still, what's to convince the other material to move out of the way? What mechanism moved the other material out of the way to make room for the iron? Earth movers, when you have a large piece of machinery moving stuff out of the ground, like to make a building, you don't just pour the iron on the ground and expect all the stuff to move out of the way. You have to dig a giant pit before you pour the concrete and steel foundation. But, you know, they ignore that as well. It's like they don't even need they don't use common sense at all in the iron catastrophe. Number six, the iron catastrophe is not applied to explain the iron cores of other older stars in our system, such as Venus, Mars, and Mercury, etc. If there is to be an actual explanation for why iron is in the center of older stars, we must be able to use it interchangeably with the other older stars. If iron core formation can only be applied to the Earth and not the other celestial bodies, then it's not even a hypothesis because the other stars have iron cores as well. Catastrophe, number 7. Catastrophe implies, the iron catastrophe, that whatever event caused the iron to move to the center of the Earth, that it happened very quickly, as opposed to uniformitarianism or a very slow change, which would be more appropriate reasoning because the Earth is billions of years old, thus meaning that whatever mechanism caused the iron to be in the center, the process would have taken a very long time, thereby making catastrophe an inappropriate word for the process. This would be akin to saying redwood trees, regardless of the fact that they are thousands of years old, grow overnight literally catastrophically. Saying redwood trees just burst out of the ground as explosive events is as inane as stating that the iron in the Earth's core just sunk there in a few days, or even 100 or 1,000 years. I'm going to skip the general relativity part. That isn't even in the same class as stellar metamorphosis. It's general relativity pseudoscience, so I'm going to skip that one. Number 9. There is no explanation as to where the rocks that formed the Earth came from. This is another gorilla in the room. That is, unless establishment wants people to believe that rocks form in the vacuum of outer space out of nothing. The explanation for how the rocks got to be in outer space is that preformed rocks from an older star, which had cooled and collapsed upon itself and formed rocks and minerals, smashed into another star, releasing a lot of interstellar shrapnel, stardust, and various other stuff. Yeah, stardust. It's because they're old stars. And I wrote at the very bottom, finally completing this talk, the fix is simple. Young stars are giant vacuum vapor deposition chambers. They form their metal cores first as they cool. Their cores are crystalline balls of iron and nickel. As they form their cores, the rest of the material will have something to deposit on, forming the new planet in its center. There you go, people. I will link this to the bottom of the page.